All right, welcome everyone to DCCC's College-Wide Reading Keynote event. My name is Matt Brophy, and I'm an English professor here at the college, as well as the Faculty Fellow for College-Wide Reading. Each year, the College-Wide Reading program selects a book that investigates an important current issue in an accessible and innovative way. The selected book offers a common reading experience to get students, faculty, and staff thinking and talking about the relevant theme. This year's book is Under the Sky We Make, How to Be Human in a Warming World by Dr. Kimberly Nicholas. And I'm so grateful to Kim for making the time to be here with us this morning. We had originally thought you'd be joining us in the late afternoon, your time from Sweden, but you're in Stanford, which is very exciting and close. That's pretty close to your family, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So it's earlier in the morning for me. I might have to sneak a bit of coffee now and then.
Right. So instead of joining us in the late afternoon, you're joining us very, very early your time. So thank you again for being here in the morning. And I hope your trip to Stanford has been pleasant for you. I also wanted to thank Professor Elias Arguiras, the coordinator of the STEAM Speaker Series, for co-sponsoring this event. And to everyone in our audience who carved out an hour of their busy day to learn more about climate change, which is an issue in which the stakes really couldn't be any higher. Originally from Sonoma, California, Dr. Kimberly Nicholas earned her PhD in Environment and Resources at Stanford University and is now an associate professor of sustainability science at Lund University in Sweden. In addition to her book, she has published numerous research articles about climate change in peer-reviewed journals, as well as articles for popular media outlets such as The Guardian and Scientific American. She also produces a digital newsletter and podcast called We Can Fix It, which I'll provide links to in the chat. Why don't I do that right now so I don't, actually, I'll do that after the introduction but I won't forget. And while I wouldn't normally talk about what we pay our guests for events like this, I wanted to share this story since it illustrates our guests' generosity and commitment to getting her message out. At a community college, we have a rather modest budget for speakers. And when I first reached out to Kim, I had no idea if we'd be able to afford her speaker fee, but she was so happy to hear we were reading her book that she quickly agreed to speak to us for free and made the excellent suggestion that we use whatever money would have gone to her to buy more copies of her book and give them to students who are interested in reading it. So if any of you out there have not yet gotten a copy of Under the Sky We Make, please reach out to me after this event, and I will do my best to get you a paperback or a download code for the ebook version. And again, I'll put my contact info in the chat in just a moment. For the next half hour or so, Kim and I will discuss some of the main themes and ideas in her book, and then we will open up the conversation to questions and comments from the audience. At that point, audience members will be invited to unmute themselves and speak with Kim directly, or if you'd prefer, you can post your questions or comments in the chat. In the meantime, please make sure you are muted, and I recommend selecting the speaker view on your Zoom settings for the best experience. Okay, let me post that info in the chat so people—
I already posted it, actually. Thank you so much, Matt.
Oh, okay. Let me make sure my contact stuff and everything's in there as well. So.
Oh, great. That I didn't do.
Yeah. Great. Okay. To get started, Kim, let me just start off by saying how much I just loved reading and teaching your book. This is the first time since I've been at the college that we've selected a book written by a scientist. And if anyone out there has any negative stereotypes about how scientists write, I think your writing will shatter those stereotypes. The book is not only fact-based and rigorously researched, as one would expect, but it's also refreshingly readable and personal in its tone, humorous, and hopeful at times, despite the gravity of your subject. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit first just about what motivated you to write this kind of book in this kind of way, rather than focusing solely on academic writing for research journals.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you everyone for making time to join us this morning. It's really a pleasure to get to talk to you. And I think this is the first time I've talked to an English professor about my book. So I'm almost a little intimidated. Like, I never took an English course in college, I'm sad to say. So this is a wonderful chance for me. This book, Under the Sky We Make, grew out of conversations I was having with my best friends from college. So I have been studying climate impacts and the climate crisis since I was an undergrad. I think it was 1990. 96 was the first time I had a chance to be, or 97, I was a research assistant as a sophomore here in California in the White Inyo Mountains, looking already back then when the impacts were much less obvious, but still detectable, at plant community changes in the Eastern Sierra and White Inyo Mountains. So it's something I had been doing for a long time, and my friends knew that, but it wasn't something that was part of our sort of daily lives and conversations. And we were able to talk about everything else, all the big stuff of our hopes and concerns and fears and shared joys and ups and downs in life. I mean, I had gotten divorced. One of my best friends died of cancer in his mid-30s, and I had dinner with his wife last night. So we'd been through big, hard stuff and could talk about big, hard stuff, but we weren't talking about climate change. And this started to feel like a big gap in my life, and it's something I wanted to share and make a conversation that could happen among friends and that people could discuss, and not just a technical conversation that was happening among scientists and engineers and experts. Because I think what really is critical to solving the climate crisis is getting more everyday people involved in their daily lives, not making it a subject that's distant and far away and scary and just for experts, but making it part of our daily lives. So that was why I wrote this book.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. The first half or so of the book focuses on establishing the factual basis that climate change is real, that it's caused by human activity, that it's a serious threat, and that scientists are sure about all of this. But of course, there are aspects of climate change that we're not sure about yet, right? And that's why scientists like yourself are continuing to study what's happening and refine their predictions about what's likely to happen in the decades ahead. I was wondering if you could help clarify for our audience, what are the most important things about climate change that we know for sure? And what are some of the things that you and your colleagues are still trying to figure out?
Sure, that's a great question. The things we know for sure are that it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it. And through the course of my career, I've really seen the certainty in these pieces evolve, and the focus shift increasingly to this fifth element, we can fix it. Because when I was an undergrad in the 90s and when I was a grad student in the early 2000s, I actually just went back and revisited this in preparing a lecture for students as kind of a overview short crash course in climate science. And the certainty has really evolved a lot in terms of, now it is just an unequivocal fact that humans, primarily from burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, are warming the climate. We know that for certain. And even 10 or certainly 20 years ago, the language was a lot less clear. It was, the balance of evidence suggests a discernible impact of human activity on the climate. But now it's just simply a fact. And that's something that's been established through a lot of different methods, many different approaches. That's a statement that's signed off by all of the world's governments and the leading scientists in the world. That's the process that the UN climate panel goes through. So that's just a fact. It's also really clear that the impacts of climate change are overwhelmingly bad. I think another evolution we've seen over the last decades was less clarity about how widespread, severe, and overwhelmingly negative the impacts of climate change are now that they are happening and not just something projected or predicted in the future. So that's very concerning. For example, there was a paper that studied thousands of climate studies and concluded there just was it wasn't meaningful to talk about the benefits of climate change. And that used to be, something that would be brought up in kind of a false balance of, well, maybe it will be better, easier to grow more crops in Canada, or the Arctic being ice-free could be good for international shipping. And while it's true that there may be some specific places or sectors that might see a narrow benefit, the overwhelming impacts to people and nature around the world, to food, water, health, the really basics of a good life on Earth, are overwhelmingly negative from climate change. So that's why I think so much focus now is, and really should be, on this last part of, we can fix it. What do we need to do? Basically leave fossil fuels in the ground and establish a sustainable relationship with nature in our way we produce food. That's how we'll fix climate change. So those are the things that are really clear. I guess the frontiers of climate science, the methods are always being refined. Something that's still a very active area of research is what's called attribution science. So being able to detect for example, when an extreme event like a heat wave or a huge storm comes, how likely is it that that storm would not have happened without human caused climate change? And there's some really cutting edge science that's made it possible in a very rapid, few weeks, as opposed to usually the years that it takes to do a scientific study, to establish the human role in events like heat waves, for example. So there's some really exciting work on that. I think some areas of active research include things like the role that clouds play in the climate system, which is complicated. But nonetheless, I would say the real frontier is focused on climate solutions. And I don't expect fundamental changes. I certainly don't expect, because it hasn't changed for hundreds of, at least, the scientific basis of human caused climate change has been known since the late 1800s. It's a very well-established physical phenomenon. So that's not going to change. The warming, it's us, we're sure. I don't see a way that it's bad is not going to change. It's going to get worse until we stop it. So I think the focus on we can fix it is really where we can make the biggest difference.
So in terms of figuring out like what the best solutions are and how to move forward, and trying to get the political will, because we can fix it doesn't mean we will fix it, right? But hopefully, right? Hopefully that uncertainty becomes something we're all committed to. The next question I wanted to ask you about was about your attention to emotions and feelings in the book, which was another thing that I didn't expect when I read the book, but was sort of delightfully surprised by. You dedicate a lot of time to examining how people react emotionally and psychologically when confronted with facts about climate change. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to make that an important part of the book? Why do feelings matter so much when it comes to tackling the challenges that lie ahead?
Sure. Well, that part of the book grew out of my own experience and processing my own feelings, like the grief I felt at seeing these beautiful places and ecosystems and wines that I had studied that are part of the character of where I'm from and that I've always loved and enjoyed. So grief and worry and loss at seeing seeing harm come to things and people that I love. And I think it took me a long time to sort of process that, partly because of my scientific training, partly because I didn't really have a vocabulary or a framework, a way of thinking about climate emotions. I'm really glad that that has become a topic in and of itself. I'm actually currently, as you mentioned, visiting at Stanford and sitting in on a course called Confronting Climate Emotions, taught by Dr. Britt Ray and others. So this is now a topic, but it's really only recently that it's emerged. And I'm really glad that those frameworks are out there for other people to use and make sense of. I think the reason for me it was important also in writing this book is sort of sharing some of those emotions, is understanding the role that emotions play in behavior and in social change, which is part of what we need to solve climate change. So, on the technical level, what we have to do to stop climate warming is stop adding carbon to the atmosphere. And since most of our energy and transport systems and daily lives involve burning fossil fuels and adding carbon to the atmosphere, that's a lot of technical, practical changes that need to happen. But in order for those changes to happen, we actually need to change hearts and minds. We need people to care about this stuff and to have the feeling of motivation that comes from protecting and acting in line with our values, protecting what we love. So I guess making that connection was important for me, also to create space for, I guess, people to honor their climate emotions, which are widespread and varied. We know from research in the social sciences and surveys that most Americans are concerned or alarmed about climate change, which is appropriate. And it's important that we honor that and allow people to have those feelings in order to help both support each other through a difficult climate crisis and also to motivate our action, to have the feeling that this really matters. What we do is so consequential right now, and acting in line with our feelings, listening to the feelings that we have, can help steer us in the direction of meaningful action.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. I know, right, like that. I love the connection between emotions and motivation that you're tapping into there, right? Because there is always, I feel like, that danger of bad news bringing about not just not grief that that one passes through and moves on to, talking about solutions, but people can get trapped in a feeling of despair or cynicism where they recognize it's bad, but feel like they're powerless, or there's nothing they can do, or that we're doomed no matter what, which are understandable in some ways, but as you say, not really emotions that will lead to the kinds of actions that we need to solve the problem. So I really appreciated that part of your book. In terms of individual responsibility, I know, I really love that final part of your book, that the we can fix it part that focuses on what we all can do to be a part of the solution. But I know for other readers, that you might have, I'm not sure if you did, but I can imagine that you might have gotten some criticism about that part, because I know there are some people who believe, and I think you sort of anticipated this criticism in the book itself, that there are, some people who argue that individual behavior will not make much of a difference, and especially in terms of, how much gas we buy or what kind of foods we eat, that it's not, that's not going to make enough of a change, or that it's not reasonable to expect ordinary people to solve a problem that's on this kind of scale, that only powerful leaders in government and business really have the resources to address this problem. And so I wonder what your response to that type of criticism would be.
I think I share a lot of the views that you just mentioned. I absolutely share the view that it's essential to hold the powerful, government and businesses, to account. We know that governments are not living up to their promises. So governments in 2015 in the Paris Agreement agreed to limit warming well below 2 degrees and pursue limiting to 1.5. And the world is not on track to do that right now. Governments aren't taking widespread, bold enough climate action. And that's a catastrophic problem. So the Climate Action Tracker is a good place to get a quick overview of what governments are doing and what they need to be doing to be Paris aligned. And that's absolutely essential. We won't stabilize the climate without governments taking their role. We also know that businesses are not acting fast enough. Unfortunately, in the last decade or so, a lot of really disturbing evidence has come to light that we know that many of the fossil fuel companies have run campaigns of disinformation for decades, that their internal science was very clear on the dangers of climate change, and they understood that using and burning their products would cause catastrophic climate change, and they've deliberately misled the public about that. So that's absolutely infuriating and devastating, and a major reason that we have a climate crisis. And there needs to be a real reckoning with those companies of what is the role of these companies going forward, what kind of reparations would be appropriate, what role should these companies play in transitioning, making a fast and fair transition to a fossil-free world, because that's what we have to do to stop climate change. And there is a role for individuals to play, both in holding these powerful companies and governments to account through our role as climate citizens, through engaging in movements, through a wide variety of actions that we have available to us. I would say for 90% of the world's population, their personal carbon footprint is not relevant. And that's because most people on Earth actually have a pretty low carbon footprint that's close to their sustainable carbon budget. In other words, where they need to be to help stop warming. However, most Americans are in this 10% of the remaining group, which is small globally, but which actually causes half of global climate pollution. So we have to stop the production and consumption of fossil fuels. And we'll need to change systems so that we can get clean energy, we can move around, we can eat food, we can lead good lives without burning fossil fuels. For 90% of the world, doing that will, at their current level of consumption, or even increased consumption for those in poverty, will be possible. But for those of us in this top 10%, which is earning more than $38,000 in the US, which again is most Americans, we do actually have to look at our personal footprint, because we won't be able to stop warming without stopping overconsumption. For many people in this top group, more than half of our emissions come from flying and driving. And it just won't be possible to have, frequent flying and frequent long distance driving, even with the best technology available today, or that will be available in the coming years, we need absolute reductions in those activities, for example, and reductions in overconsumption of meat, and especially beef, which is a main driver of climate and the biodiversity crisis. So we absolutely have to hold the powerful to account, and we have to look if our personal footprint is above the average for our own country, that's a good sign that actually we do have to address overconsumption. And that's part of a cultural change that also needs to happen, which will further unlock and enable policy changes together.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's a good sort of transition in the next couple of questions I wanted to ask you about, which are about transportation and food. And so I know, like, here in the US, it can be just even hard just to imagine what sustainable transportation might look like. The expectation in most of the country is that people will get where they need to go by car. Few regions have high quality, affordable public transportation here. And culturally, as you're saying, many of us just love our cars. Electric vehicles offer an alternative, but not a great one, in the sense that most are quite expensive. And you yourself in the book argue that it's really not the best solution to our dependence on gasoline powered transportation. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the way forward for transportation in America, and how you think we might be able to break our 100-year love affair with automobiles.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it really resonates for me, especially now, as I am staying in the US, in California, the home of the freeway and the car. I am using a car while I'm here. And so I do, which I don't use in Sweden, we're car free there. So I do really feel the difficulty, and I see the challenge ahead. That said, car dependence is a choice. It's a policy choice that's been made over decades and more than a century now, as you point out. And it can be unmade by a series of better choices. It's going to take time, and it's going to be a big project, and it has to happen all over the country, in cities and in rural areas. And it needs a lot of work, but it can happen. And we see some hopeful examples in places like Copenhagen, Denmark. So now Copenhagen is known as a bicycle paradise, but it was actually a very car-dependent city in the 1950s. And if you go there now, for the first time a few years ago, more bicycles than cars cross the city. Bicycling is really the default preferred form of transportation. This is in a place that has not the best weather, I have to say. It's pretty gray and rainy. So California has a big advantage there in having, much nicer cycling weather. But even on these gray, rainy streets, you see all kinds of people of all ages. I've seen 3-year-olds cycling independently in Copenhagen. I've seen 80-year-olds, and everybody in between, wearing, nice business clothes going to work, or casual clothes meeting friends. So the point is, culturally, it's really integrated. And that's because a campaign by a committed small group of citizens took space back from cars starting decades ago, and took that space that had been used for driving and parking and gave it to cycling and walking and public transit. And those kind of investments made a huge difference. So we've seen, I published a study last year together with Paula Kuss, where we looked at what has worked to reduce car dependence in cities. We focused on Europe, which has a goal to have 100 climate neutral cities by 2030. As you know, that's very soon, less than 7 years away. So there are big changes needed. And we found cities that have successfully reduced car use. And basically, they followed this model of Copenhagen, which was both carrots and sticks. It was explicitly aiming to reduce cars by making it more difficult and expensive to drive and park, physically taking away space from cars by blocking streets, transforming them into bike lanes and walkways and bus stops, and then simultaneously using that space and the money that was generated from making cars pay their fair share to support these infrastructure changes. So it is possible, and it can start at home. I mean, I think you can, in the city where you live or on the campus where you work. Our study found a lot of universities that had done really well, actually. And so working at the university level can be really effective. But yeah, it is definitely a big job, but it's a really important one. And that's a great place to get involved for climate action at the local level, because in general, in broad pictures, things are moving in the right direction with decarbonizing electricity, of closing down fossil fuel plants and replacing them with clean energy. We need to speed that up enormously, but that process is underway. But we're really, really behind where we need to be globally, and especially in the US, in transportation and decarbonizing transportation and making it possible to meet all your needs without depending on a car. And that will take a lot of work by people in every city. And you'll be able to see really tangibly, here's the bike lane that I built, here's the cars that aren't driving on this street, and the trees that got planted as a result in the place where you live. So I think that's a really good place to start.
Great, thanks so much. And I know you focus mostly on sort of examples that you saw in Europe in terms of the sort of hopefulness moving forward. Is there anything that you've seen sort of going on in the US in terms of movement in that direction, that in American cities, or we really need to look to Europe for inspiration at this point?
There are cities that are making big steps in the US. I know San Francisco has been working hard, and I support an organization called the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition that I think has been really fighting for this and trying to improve cycling in San Francisco, which also connects with a lot of issues that I also care about, like income and wealth inequality. So often it's the richest who have cars and drive the most. So most people benefit, the people who benefit the most by having better transit and better access to cycling are often those who are most marginalized. So it can really help equalize society. Women often are quite empowered by cycling, for example, and having access to jobs and transportation. So San Francisco, I know, has been doing good work. New York, I think, as well. And I think many smaller cities around the country that don't get their stories as widespread, but it often is just a local organization that is working both on the policy level and on the sort of practical boots on the ground, bike lanes and changing incentives and infrastructure. And I think one thing I'm really reflecting on this visit to the US is how often it's just assumed that might makes right. In the US, people don't make the argument for fairness and for public benefit of the vast majority of people. It's often the case that a really small group of often quite already privileged people fight for maintaining the status quo and make a lot of noise and prevent change that would actually benefit almost everyone else. And I just think that's wrong. And I think we need people to call that out where it happens. And transportation inequality is a big opportunity to do that.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, I had heard about like bike share programs in particular sort of popping up and growing, and even in cities like New York incorporating e-bikes into their sort of public bike shares. So, for people who maybe don't feel like they have physically the capability to do that, they can have a sort of power assist, with an e-bike or something like that, can sort of make cycling open to more people. To switch gears a little bit towards food, you mentioned before the impact that eating meat, in particular beef, or that industry, I should say, has on the climate. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit how that is. I think a lot of people, they've heard the fossil fuel stuff, but maybe they haven't heard the reason behind, or the science behind, how our food choices actually impact the climate, and aren't fully don't fully understand how moving to a mostly plant-based diet, as you suggest in the book, would really make a difference on this issue. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the climate problem has two root sources. About 3/4 of climate pollution in total comes from our energy system and from burning fossil fuels. And that's to power plants, to heat and cool our homes, to move our cars around. Then the remaining quarter or so comes from basically our food system, how we use land to grow food or to raise cows, forestry and other activities. So the bottom line of what we need to do to stop climate change is to leave fossil fuels in the ground. That will take care of the first 3/4. But since to stabilize the climate, we actually have to get to zero carbon and rapidly declining and almost eliminate other greenhouse gases. So for that remaining quarter of climate pollution that comes from our food system, the solution there is to have a food system that works with rather than against nature. And animals might be a part of that, but at a much smaller scale than they are today. It's really staggering how humans have completely reshaped the earth to raise a huge number of animals for our food system. And that's taking space away from nature. That's causing a lot of climate pollution, especially from animals like cows, which emit a lot of methane. And it's bad for our health. In terms of following a healthy and sustainable diet, the recommendation is no more than 2 beef burgers per month if you include beef in your diet. So those kind of shifts where we're having a food system that is not based on huge inputs of intensive resources to grow plants and animals as fast as possible and maximize production, but at the cost of creating a lot of waste, including climate pollution, using huge amounts of land, because animals take much more land to raise than plants do. They're much less efficient, basically, at converting sunlight into food. So plants do that, and then animals have to eat plants. So there's just this big loss of efficiency in terms of resources, and that translates to water and energy and land, all resources that are finite and that the other 8 million species that we share the planet with also depend on to have a home. So the healthy and sustainable diet recommendations are about no more than 2 beef burgers per month, a couple of servings per week of chicken, fish, and eggs, and 1 serving per day of either dairy milk or cheese, a piece of cheese about the size of your thumb. So there is room to have some animal products in a healthy and sustainable diet. The most climate friendly is to choose plant-based. And anyway, we're aiming for at least half or more of your plate to be covered by fruits and veg, plant-based proteins like lentils and beans. Those have huge both health and environmental benefits.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that. You had mentioned a little bit earlier about the efforts to decarbonize the electric grid. I know, we hear a lot of talk about the potential for solar and wind energy expansion in doing that. One thing that didn't come up in your book that I wondered if you could share your thoughts on is whether or not you think nuclear energy has a part to play in that sort of decarbonizing impact of the electric grid, or if you think the risks that go along and the costs of going along with expanding nuclear power are worth it or not in terms of being part of that solution.
I mean, in the theoretical world, nuclear is a carbon-free source of energy, so it doesn't cause climate pollution, which is a huge advantage. In the real world, nuclear has played a really limited role in helping the clean energy transition along. There are a few countries that have used it successfully and have made policy choices to do that. And basically, my view is where you have existing nuclear plants, it makes a lot of sense to keep running them and doing that, of course, safely, but using that carbon-free power. But there isn't as big of a role for nuclear, as wind and solar, for example. So pretty much from all the modeling studies, the majority of clean energy comes from renewable sources. And nuclear does have a role to play. I mean, the scenarios that get to zero the fastest and avoid the most harm do see an increase in nuclear. But there was a paper a couple of years ago in PNAS that really kind of opened my eyes. It was a group of, Granger Morgan, I think, was one of the authors. It was a group of energy scientists who are pro-nuclear themselves, but kind of lamenting what they argue is the fact that nuclear just doesn't have a huge possibility to play a role because there's been so much resistance, basically, because there's a lot, often, nuclear is slow to build. There's a lot of political resistance. It's often runs over budget in both time and money. And time is something we just don't have, right? I mean, we need to be shutting down fossil power as fast as possible and replacing it with clean power. And there may be some long-term role for nuclear there, but it's just hasn't proven successful in decarbonizing existing fossil power. And that's the main thing we need to be doing now. I mean, to be on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we have to cut emissions in half in the next 7 years. So we need stuff that works now, that's ready to go now, that can come online tomorrow and replace fossil power tomorrow. And that's not nuclear.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and that clears that up a lot for me. I could see how it could, the existing nuclear plants, right, have a role to play, in terms of, but that the expansion makes more sense to focus on wind and solar because it has less of those obstacles you're talking about. Thanks so much. I have one more question that I like to ask before we switch over to the audience questions. So those of you in the audience, if you have some questions on your mind, now might be a good time to type them out in the chat, or if you're comfortable unmuting yourself and speaking directly, I'll be inviting you to do so soon. And that's either way is fine. So my last question, you mentioned the importance of climate activism and what we can do as citizens to hold those accountable in positions of power to do more. What are some specific things you would recommend to our students who are interested in getting involved and advocating for positive change?
Yeah, great question. So I focus on these 5 roles that we can play for high impact climate action. We've talked about the role as a consumer. If you're in this group that has a higher footprint than average for the US, you have a meaningful role to play there. We've talked about as a citizen, we'll go into more detail. As an investor is another one where we spend our time and money in supporting divestment from paying for fossil fuels with our banks and loans and stocks and so on. As a role model, the way we influence others and the conversations we have are super important. And as a professional, which is really relevant for students thinking about their careers and how we make every job a climate job, there's really meaningful roles to play there. When talking about one of these 5 roles, so the climate citizen, we know from research that the most important climate action there is to vote. A study in Canada showed that voting for a party with weak climate policies, in this case, it was the Conservative Party of Canada, could more than triple your personal carbon footprint. So it does, because of the rollback in clean power, for example, and policies that would entail. So it does make a huge difference to vote for a good candidate. You can look at the League of Conservation Voters, LCV, has an environmental scorecard, and that's been shown, voting for candidates with a good climate score has been shown to meaningfully reduce emissions. You can join and support organizations that are working for climate action. I'm sure there are groups on campus that are working for fossil free, for example, the Sunrise Movement. There are many, many excellent organizations, and we can talk more in detail. Getting media attention is a really important one. So that can be through writing it to your campus newspaper or a local publication, raising concerns. Peaceful protest has also been shown to move legislators and make policy change. And these are actually exactly the kind of things, I'll put a link in the chat. These are the kind of things that I cover in my monthly newsletter, We Can Fix It, and go into more detail on, specifically what does collective action look like and how can you get involved. So I think that's a really important step.
Great, thanks so much. We do have a few questions popping up in the chat, so let's see if we can tackle those first, and then if anyone wants to unmute themselves and speak up directly, we'll have time for that as well. The first question I think was more for administrators at the college than for you, about mapping out bike lanes to Marple and Downingtown, a couple of our campuses. I think that's a great suggestion, and hopefully, the more the college can do to make it comfortable for students to bike to campus, that would be great. Professor Argyris had a question for you about how optimistic you are about our future in the next 2 or 3 decades.
I mean, I think climate scientists and activists have a very complicated relationship with hope, right? And for me, hope doesn't play a big role in my daily life. I see the world that I want, and I try to live my life in a way that makes that world a reality and live it into existence. And of course, I'm just one person and I can't single-handedly make all the changes I would want, but I can see what needs to be done. I try to identify where I can be useful and do that. And I find that process extremely meaningful and beautiful and joyful. And the people that are in this work together are incredible friends and source of solidarity and fun. So I think what really makes the difference is getting more people to that place where they're able to meaningfully engage and create communities and take actions that they enjoy and find meaningful and are helping to stop climate change. So that is fully possible for us to do. But I think I try to get away from really binary thinking of black and white, or, you know, we win or we lose, or we solve everything or we don't. I mean, life is messy, and I don't want to be too attached to specific outcomes like markers of success. I mean, I do really believe, and I wrote in my book, you know, I think a pretty fair way to measure the success of the whole human endeavor is parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, because that is really telling us a really important marker for our species, the mark we're leaving on Earth, the life we're living, and the way we're making it possible for 8 billion other people right now and billions more in the future, and these 8 million species we share the planet with to live. So that does really, really matter. But I guess I think, you know, it's the work is necessary and meaningful and worth doing, and we can make a huge difference by doing it. So that's kind of how I approach it. So I don't want to say, yes, I'm optimistic, or no, I'm pessimistic, or it's kind of trying to have more of a process focus, because I think that's what will keep me in this work for the rest of my life, which is, you know, this is going to be an ongoing challenge, and new challenges will come up. So I want to keep doing the work.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, either, you know, whether we're optimistic or not, there's work to be done, right? And if we set a goal like, you know, limiting warming to 2 degrees and we don't meet it and it gets to 2 degrees, we still have to keep working. It's not like we just give up at that point, right? Then you have to limit it to 2.25 or do what you can to, you know, whatever happens to keep doing what we can, right? There's a comment by Scott here about, you know, how there are still many people who are skeptical about global warming in general. Many people who are unwilling or unable to give up their cars or change their diets. There's not really a question there, just a comment, but I don't know if you would want to respond to that in terms of, I guess, how we respond to people who sort of persist in sort of either not reckoning with the facts or resistant to changing their behaviors, or just don't believe that it's possible for them.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think about that a lot. I guess the most important thing to know there is, sure, there are people who are not going to change or who are going to resist making the changes we need to stop climate catastrophe. That's not the folks I'm worried about. The folks I'm worried about, because they're actually a quite small group, but they're extremely vocal. So they're really overrepresented in our minds. And what we know from the data, for example, from the Yale Center for Climate Communication, it's less than 10% of Americans who are dismissive of the climate crisis. That's a really small group, but boy, are they loud and effective. So what can we learn from them about being louder and more effective ourselves? How can we make this concerned majority of Americans, those who are concerned or alarmed about climate change, how can we center their voices in the conversation? And I think there's a lot of work. I would recommend the work by John Cook, who runs a website called Skeptical Science, and has a course on debunking misinformation, does lots of amazing things. If you really want to dive into, you know, climate dismissal and denial and how to deal with that, there are great resources out there. For me, I've chosen not to do that, because what I see from the research is what makes change happen is getting 25% of the population committed to making positive change. That's actually enough to tip norms. So we have those numbers already of people who are concerned but passive. And what I'm trying to do is reach that group, give them meaningful action to take, ways to get involved and become concerned and active. And that's what will make the fundamental difference. So I just put in the chat a graphic that my wonderful colleague Emma Johansson made, from a messy sketch that I made that was basically like, here I am, a climate scientist. I'm worried about the majority who are concerned but doing nothing. That's who I lose sleep over, which is often many people on this call. And many of the people who I'm worried about are instead worried about the people who I don't care about, this small group of dismissives. So I wouldn't worry about, and I wouldn't lose time and energy on trying to convert, the really recalcitrant and resistant. For that time that you could argue perhaps unproductively with one person, you could get 10 people to make a positive change. And that's going to feel way better for you. That's going to make a bigger difference in the world. So I would really consciously choose where to devote your energy and not worry about those who are not on board or not interested.
Very practical advice. Thank you so much. Next question, Sarah was asking about if you think the actions we take today will be enough to prevent the direct impacts of climate change. I'm assuming, since you believe we can fix it, that that's a yes. But I know you mentioned in the book as well that there are, even if we stopped putting any more carbon in the atmosphere tomorrow, like even if we could just sort of stop on a dime like that the climate, because of the damage that's already been done, that we're still going to see impacts moving forward. And so what at this point, in a way, are the things that maybe we can't fix, or the things that we are going to have to deal with and adapt to no matter what, even if we do our best job to limit further carbon output?
Right. So in something that's new for me, and that I still see other scientists get wrong, because it's changed our scientific understanding in the last 10 years. So when I was in grad school, I learned that there was a lot of warming, further future warming, that was inevitably baked into the climate system. So in that sense, it didn't really matter how fast we were able to stop burning fossil fuels, because there was all this committed warming. That actually turns out to be incorrect. And the latest understanding is that the climate will stop warming very soon, within a couple of years, after we stop adding carbon to the atmosphere. So that's really good news, because that means our efforts make a really big difference. The bad news is that the climate will keep warming as long as we're adding carbon to it. And, carbon emissions have been going up, 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 up. They have to go down and go all the way to zero. And as they're going down, they're going in the right direction, but it's like a bathtub where you have the faucet is still on, you're still adding, just at a slower rate, you're still adding more carbon. So warming is going to continue until we actually completely get to zero and stop adding carbon to the atmosphere. And that is going to take time, because we have to, not just shut everything down, but replace it with clean energy, for example. But the faster we can do that, the better our lives will be, and the more harm we'll avoid. There are already impacts. I mean, we see that in our daily lives. The fires in California, which affected my family, my parents had to evacuate in 2017. Thankfully, they were safe, and very lucky that their home was also safe. But of course, many people have not been so lucky. We know that those fires in the US West have gotten about twice as big and dangerous, and the area burned has been doubled by human-caused climate change. So we're already seeing dangerous impacts. That's just one example. Ultimately, we might want to focus on removing carbon from the atmosphere to get, we've already warmed the Earth more than 1 degree Celsius, and we're seeing harm from that warming. In the long term, to undo that harm and prevent the harm that we're already experiencing, we may want to try to remove carbon back to the levels of, pre-industrial, basically, or around 350 parts per million would be considered a safer level. But I think our task, I can barely imagine achieving that. It is a very long-term generational project. So the thing I'm trying to do in my lifetime is see carbon actually stabilize in the atmosphere. The faster we do that, the more opportunity we have to actually cope with and thrive through even the changes that causes. Thank you.
The next question from Nilufar turns back to nuclear. I know you already addressed that. She's sort of asking about if there are things we could learn from the countries that have made it a big part of their grid, like France. Are there ways that that we could learn from them, maybe in terms of dealing with the controversies or obstacles, and invest in that here? Is there anything you wanted to add about that?
I actually don't know the answer to that question, but I'm mentoring a master's student who's looking at that very question right now. So maybe come back to me in 6 months, because I'm not sure. I personally don't see that as the most productive use of the next 6 to 7 years when we're trying to cut carbon in half. But I'm not sure if you see the change you want to make as really focused on nuclear, how do you make that actually the most effective? I'm actually not sure the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. Jen Roth in her Earth Science class wanted to ask you if you had a new book project in the works, or sort of what's next for you as a writer.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. It's very encouraging. I do, and I've kind of been sitting on it and doing nothing about it for a while, but I have a draft on my computer that is gathering dust, and I should probably get back to it. And I think my agent and editor would agree with you that it would be good to keep writing. So I do really love writing. I mean, I love reading. That's why I love writing, because I love engaging with books. And it's such a privilege to be able to contribute something that other people read and appreciate. So it's really encouraging to hear if people had this book resonate for them, and it keeps me motivated to keep writing. I think I'm having a challenge kind of, structuring my life basically and figuring out how much time do I want to devote to writing? How much should that be where I'm really putting my energies versus research and teaching, which is, my actual job at the moment. So how do I combine these? I'm struggling with, but it's nice to hear that you would want to read more. So I will try to keep writing for you.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine that. Finding the time for all of that must be quite a challenge. John wanted to unmute and talk about a climate adaptation company. John, did you want to go ahead and speak up?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add something, and then I have a quick question. I was listening to NPR the other day, and there's this company called Tomorrow.io that was created by an Israeli Air Forceman. And basically they're going to be putting up satellites that cover the entire Earth that will provide weather radar for parts of the world that don't have radar coverage, like oceans and I think parts of India and parts of Africa. And it'll also provide better radar and data for the developed world. And like it'll just like help greatly with extreme weather, like knowing what to do and like how to adapt to it. Like knowing what to do ahead of time, because it gives you data down to the second, and it'll like help us out like that. And I was just wondering, is there anything else in the works that you know of that will help us adapt to the damage that's already been done by climate change?
Thanks for that. And thanks for that resource. I actually am not familiar with it, so I'll have to check it out. I mean, the big picture is the way that humanity responds to climate change. We essentially have 3 choices, which is prevent, prepare, and suffer. And obviously, ideally would have been to prevent harm before it happens. We've gone far enough and failed to mitigate fast enough that we now have to do some preparation. The more preparation we can do, the less suffering we can expect. So it used to be framed maybe 20 years ago, there was this idea of a trade-off between adaptation, which is preparing, and mitigation, which is preventing. Now we recognize we have to do both. We have to stop climate change at the root and stop burning fossil fuels, turn off the faucet of the filling bathtub of carbon to stabilize the climate. And we also have to prepare. And we know that extreme events have gotten and are getting more frequent and severe, for example. So it's really important that people know how to prepare for disasters, how to help each other in disasters. I've written about this a little bit. I can put the link in the chat and we can fix it. I think having more information, especially in parts of the world that are poorly served right now, is a really important piece. And it's true that fewer people die in disasters now, partly because of better warnings and better infrastructure. So that's really good news. I guess it's also important to keep in mind that something that came out of the last UN climate panel report that was a lot clearer than it has been before is that there are limits to adaptation. There are changes that are just intolerable or not possible to adapt to. And the more warming we have, the more likely we are to experience those. So I guess there's real urgency both in preventing future warming as fast as we can and in preparing for consequences that are likely to happen and make sure we know how to respond. I mean, one really concrete example there is that I have a go bag packed with the essentials in it. And that is something I've done since my parents had to evacuate in 2017. Mm-hmm. And what they brought with them was like a pair of underwear, a head of lettuce, and a can of Tab, which was my mom's favorite soda that they don't even make anymore. So clearly this is not, you know, the most well thought out plan, but I fully understand if you're in an emergency situation and you haven't prepared, you're not in a position to make the best decision. So I think it is really useful to, for example, have first aid training, something really clear and necessary that people often don't think about in preparing is get to know your neighbors. We know from disasters, and we see this around the world, when a real disaster happens, there just aren't enough resources for professionals to help everybody who needs help. And we never know if we're going to be in a position of needing help or actually being okay ourselves and being able to help our neighbors. And the more we know each other, that you know each other's name, that you can, you know, borrow an egg or a cup of sugar, or drop off some cookies, help with childcare, borrow, share tools, have these kind of real relationships with our physical neighbors is one of the most important predictors for how people survive in disasters. So that's a really important, and it's obviously fun to, you know, have a backyard barbecue and or a picnic or an activity, or, you know, garden together or do whatever with your neighborhood. So that's a really important, you know, low tech preparation.
We are almost out of time. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but a lot of gratitude. And of course, I'm very grateful as well. Kim, thanks so much. Was there anyone else who was waiting to speak up, to unmute themselves, to ask anything? Okay, I think we're going to call it a day then. Thanks so much, Kim, for taking the time, and thanks so much for your eye-opening and enjoyable book. And for all the important work you do as a teacher, as a researcher, as a writer, all of that, as an activist. I really admire it so much, and I'm sure this time was a great inspiration to many students. So thanks again. Wish you the best in your next project, and thanks so much for spending this hour with us.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was great to hear from you, and I would love to keep in touch. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. All right. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Bye, everyone. Oh, I will put my contact again in the chat. I think John had asked for it. So yes, if anyone doesn't have a copy of Kim's book yet, please do contact me. I have a handful of paperbacks and a bunch of download codes for ebooks, and I can make sure anyone who wants to read it has a copy. So please do reach out.
Thank you for taking care of that. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.